Hello again, Reg viewers, and welcome back to our latest Regcast. As you can see, we're talking about many devices, one policy today. What does that mean? You'll find out in a minute. My name's Tim Phillips, as you know. I'm wearing my glasses today, and it's the first time I've been able to see right to the other side of the giant Register studio that we have here. It is enormous, this place. You should, honestly, you should see it sometime. In fact, if we do enough Regcasts, maybe we'll have all of you at one time will get to sit at our big table. I really hope so. Now, what are we talking about today? As you can see on our slide, we are talking about many devices. I notice also on the artwork to the slide for the first time that we've got a little iPod in there. I'm not sure we're going to be talking about securing iPods or anything like that, so I hope that none of you have come along and are hoping that that's going to happen. So, now, as you know, my name's Tim Phillips, but the more important people today here are sitting over to my left, and the most important person today who's come halfway around the world to be with us from Blue Coat Systems, Sasi Murthy. Hello, Sasi.
Good morning.
And Sasi, so tell us a little bit about Blue Coat. We've never had Blue Coat in the studio before.
Great, super. Well, thank you for having us. Blue Coat Systems, we're an American-based company, and our whole entire focus is leadership in the web security space. We secure 97% of the Fortune 500 businesses with enterprise-grade web security and policy controls. And I'm here today to talk about extending that out to the many devices that organizations have to support now.
Okay, thank you very much. And also, you'll recognise him. He's been in the studio hundreds of times. I'm not sure how many times it is now. I'll ask him in a minute. From Freeform Dynamics, it's Andy Buss.
Hi, Tim, and it's literally thousands of times.
It seems like it, actually, Andy. I mean, it really does. But now, this sort of thing, you talk about this sort of thing quite a lot, don't you? I mean, this is a problem that a lot of businesses aren't really on top of.
That's right. What we've seen in the last few years is really an explosion of new devices coming to market. And what's happening is people picking them up, using them, getting used to them in personal life. And they've been making their way into companies, often through the back door, sometimes through the front door, but more often we've seen user behaviour actually driving adoption. So there's quite a difference in the market between those companies that are active in dealing with the problem and those where it's sneaking up on them from behind. And what we found when we've surveyed the reg base, for example, is that about half the markets see that a significant proportion, so upwards of more than a quarter of their workforce, are using sort of mobile devices and personal devices in their day-to-day routines. And what we find is that's actually likely underrepresenting the problem because very few companies have active monitoring of IT assets, let alone of device usage. So there's often, in our experience, a subculture of devices being used for work that the company has no knowledge of.
So those ones that say they've got a problem, it's because they know they've got a problem, and those ones that say they haven't got a problem, it's because they don't actually really know that they have got a problem.
Yes, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, there's the unknown unknowns.
Oh, okay. Okay, let's make them known knowns by the end, will we?
Yes.
Shall we? So that's why we're asking, is a single security policy possible? So we'll find that out in the next hour. Before we find that out, I need to tell you how to communicate with us, because we're coming out of our little tiny television window to you. You can communicate back to us. Look at the little button above my head. You can ask me questions. You ask me questions, they pop up here. I ask them to Sasi and Andy. They give you answers. It's no good complaining that we don't talk about the things you want us to talk about if you don't tell us, and this is a way you can do it. We did this a couple of days ago. We had tons of questions. I asked people to start sending in the questions, and all of a sudden they're all coming like this. It's quite hard to cope with, but more fun that way. You can also get hold of the slides on a PDF if you want. Give us your feedback afterwards, but wait until it's over before you give us a feedback, because otherwise, otherwise you can't tell how good it is or not. So let's get on with this. Andy, introduce us to what this problem is when we come to a single security policy.
Absolutely. So here is an illustration just of what I was talking about before, which is that personal equipment is coming into the workplace, and it's becoming more prevalent and being driven by the emergence of things like the iPad tablet space, but the smartphone that's now been well established. And if we just look at the figures, this is quite astounding that personal equipment has become so rapidly established, whereas for the last 20, 30 years, it's all about IT control, IT-issued devices, IT-managed devices. But in the space of 4, 5 short years, it's almost turned around. So it's being driven now by user or departmental behaviour rather than centralised control. And
yeah, but, on the other hand, I'm looking at your diagram here, and you've got this big half here. We're saying that less than a quarter of the workforce are using personal equipment. So that doesn't sound too bad.
No, but if you imagine that your knowledge workers, for example, may be a small proportion of the overall business, but if they're using personal equipment, that's very valuable data that if it's not secured and goes missing can lead to a big impact. So it's not necessarily about the proportion, but it's who's using it. But the other side, of course, is often these are underreported. So there's often an optimism that these things are not happening because you don't see it in terms of your normal usage patterns. But if you then get an external assessor or auditor to come in and actually have a look, we often find that the usage is far in excess of what's being estimated or measured. And we find that not just with mobile devices, but even routine IT stuff like license usage. We just know that many times this is not managed or tracked. And when it comes to doing an audit, things are very different from what they're anticipated to be.
We're back to our unknown unknowns again, aren't we, Sasi? Is this similar to what you see from your users?
This is very similar to what we see with our customer base and the folks that we talk with, and this concept that people have, they're not just using personal devices. Most users today have a minimum of 2 to 3 devices. But I want to touch on something that Andy just mentioned as well, which is it isn't just the percentages. When you look at the threat landscape today, and we're going to talk about this a bit later, the sophistication with how threats are targeted today has everything to do with what he just said about who is using it. Mm-hmm. And so you look in organizations and businesses have, very significant targets. And it's not always the CEO. It can be the CFO. It can be an engineering architect. It could be somebody who has access to source code. So depending on your function and what is valuable in the cybercrime world, those users that are using mobile devices or multiple devices have created an open door.
So we don't actually need for everyone in the organisation to be using lots of devices. We just need for some important people to be using the multiple devices, which sort of brings us to the next slide, doesn't it? I've just looked at that. And it said, thanks for that, Sasi, actually. That really worked quite well because you brought to Andy's next slide about who it is that's actually using this stuff.
Yeah, and no surprises here. IT staff like to use these devices because they're really good, they're technologically advanced, they enable you to do stuff, and tech guys really like to experiment. So quite often, a lot of this is being driven by the IT department in terms of assessing and use. But if we look a little bit further down, it's
I'm
really
in the second line.
It's about senior business management. And say what you will, you can set any policy you like, but if senior business management come in demanding to be supported, it's almost impossible to say no. But if the workforce is coming in and saying we want to use it, that's a different question. You then have to make the business case to management to go and support these devices. But if it's the business leaders, the CEO or the VPs, etc., that are coming in asking to be supported on the iPad or the iPhone or an Android phone, that is often when it's a good time to come in and actually say, look, if you're wanting to use this, we can't just do it on an exception basis. We've got to really think about how we support these mobile devices. So
in the real world, you're nodding along to this, Sasi. In the real world, you basically have to say yes when the CEO comes in and says, I want to use an iPad.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to drive the business, and these are very highly compensated individuals. You want them to be able to be as productive where they are. And fundamentally, everybody else gets it for free. You have to solve it for that. And we see plenty of examples of the CEO exception. So we're going to talk a lot about policy controls and the kinds of things organizations need to think about. And you always know that the CEO is always going to be the one whose job requirements and leadership requirements cause everybody to question limitations and restrictions. So it's about enabling.
So your point to this is that when the CEO comes in and demands the CEO exception, then you sort of have to say yes because he or she is your boss. But on the other hand, don't just then make that an exception and pretend it's never happened.
Well, in our experience, what usually happens is if you allow 1 on, then you're allowing 5 on, then it's 15. Where do you stop? And if all you do is manage by exception, you end up with a situation that gets ultra complex and hard to manage. And you have no consistency. And then tying it all back again becomes hard. So it's really about, if this is starting to become prevalent, that the senior business management are actually actively using these and promoting it, and let's not forget that then permeates through the rest of the organisation as a cultural aspiration.
Yeah.
You need a consistent place to start from to try and make this work. So you may start dealing by exception, and it may work for a short time, but very quickly it's likely to overwhelm the policies, procedures, etc.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's happening, because I completely agree that that's the dynamic that we see with businesses today, and it's certainly what we see with our customers. But I think it's worth calling out here that while we may be reactive today, this whole shift to mobile devices is incredibly enabling. And if we start to encourage businesses to think about this and not do the exception routes, which is what's happening today, it can be very empowering, and it can really be a way to enable your workforce and move your business in a different direction. There's certainly complexities that we're going to talk about, but this isn't a negative, and this isn't what we want people to react to. We want people to proactively embrace the fact that multiple devices can do good things for your business depending on your objectives. With the right kind of controls in place and the right kind of strategic plan that Andy's highlighting, they can absolutely do great things.
We're just in this in-betweeny time at the moment where the devices have shown up. They are doing some good things, but they're also doing some bad things as well.
There's always that possibility, and we've just got to take into account as well that we're at a crux at the moment. There's a transition point in the industry where traditional phones are now, in the established economies like the UK, US and others, smartphones are now starting to outship traditional voice-only phones by quite some margin. And not just in the consumer space, but in the enterprise space. So there is a ton of devices coming in now that are compute-enabled data carriers, usable everywhere, and we need to make sure we get on top of this, because if we don't, it's going to be a massive problem.
We're all smartphones about this, but I noticed on this slide, it's originally a Blue Coat slide, I believe, isn't it, Sasi, that you keep the laptop in there.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's a great point to highlight. The smartphones and the explosion we're seeing and all the trends that we talk about, Apple devices and so on, I think it is a problem in itself, but it really shines the light on a problem that's existed that people like us have talked about for a long time. Laptops traditionally have been that corporate device that goes in and out of the network. Mm-hmm. And for years, the industry, we've been trying to focus attention on the fact that these are security gaps. And we often talk about malware Mondays, those laptops that have been home for the weekend, doing things that people want to be able to do. Nobody has malicious intentions in mind, but they're often unaware. Those devices come back in Monday mornings and bad things start to happen. But now you extrapolate that onto these multiple devices now, and I think what we're trying to call out here is, in the course of these technical capabilities that people have that we were just discussing, you have access. You have applications. You have portable devices. You can now travel and work from anywhere. You can watch your kids play soccer and go ahead and take care of what you need to do at the side of the field, because all this technology enables you. This creates now this blurring of corporate and personal use. And again, it's not some malicious intent on the part of users to try to do something negative. They're simply going about the things that they need to do, which may move from taking care of soccer business or downloading kids' textbooks or YouTube videos for kids to watch educational things on the same device that you're now going to access your corporate email or access a corporate application from a remote location. This creates that challenge for organizations, and when we start talking about now extending out control to these devices, it creates another challenge, which is that contention between the organization and the user. This is my device. No, you can't put anything on it. But the organization is looking at this saying, this is my corporate data, so yes, we need. And so that creates a very interesting conundrum.
Well, I've got an idea for this. This is that the organisation wins, locks everything down, no unofficial use.
Well, I think in the user-mandated world, and users have driven us here, and when we talk about this whole explosion of devices, the problem is that this wasn't corporate sanctioned. So devices are being brought in by users, and now they're blurring. What's the benefit for the organization? They're actually able to now unleash much more productivity, much more innovation by embracing this. What's the challenge for the user? People inherently want and expect, and I think I would say personally have a right to privacy. And they want to know that they still have the enablement and the access to content they want. But you've got organizations that need to maintain some level of control. So there's some awareness work that has to get done, but locking down isn't an answer. No. Blocking Facebook isn't an answer anymore. It's a business imperative. And the businesses that embrace that are the ones that are going to get ahead.
Mm-hmm. And we generally find that if you are too strict, there's either backdoors get found and people work around the issues, which creates more problems, or people are not satisfied in the jobs, which makes it a less attractive place to work. IT these days has to be a service provider to the business if that's how the workers want and need to work to be productive in the modern world, just saying, sorry, you can't do anything with these devices, we're locking them down, is not likely to lead to a lot of synergy between IT and what the business wants.
I suppose, and I'm looking on the bars on your chart here, and the Windows PCs have got the most official use. They've also got the most unofficial use as well.
Absolutely, and this is something that I think often gets overlooked, which is the fact that the home PC, for example, something that many people have. We know that the desktop PC is still prevalent in the office as well, although being replaced by notebooks. But oftentimes the home PC is the comfortable one for people to use. And with email, people email their documents backwards and forwards using new services like Dropbox and others. They're very happy just to take work home and do it on the home PC. And it's one of the most prevalent forms of use your own device. Mm-hmm. But often those are not secured by corporate policy, security or other areas, oftentimes not even thought of at all when it comes to a use-your-own-device policy.
So it's this stuff that we're not thinking about, we're not securing at all. This is what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. We've got to think about all the ways that people want to work, which includes PCs, new tablets, smartphones, any type of device where people are wanting to work. And how do you balance the personal use versus the secure business use without letting the two impact each other too much?
Mm-hmm. Is there anything about this that's going to be unexpected for people who are watching this, Sasi? That they're thinking, yeah, this problem's been going on for as long as I've been in the IT department.
Well, I think the thing that people have to start to realize, and when I look at the number of customers that I talk with, and I've met with customers even here in the UK, and we talk about what are they doing with these mobile devices accessing corporate assets, and they're still working on it. You're only as strong as your weakest link. And when you look at multiple devices now being used, any device that doesn't have some level of security or control extended to it in the way that makes sense is the weakest link. And that becomes the path to data breach, to financial loss. So I think that people have a false sense of security, and I think that's something that folks have to start to recognize, that they have to work towards this strategy that we're talking about. And there's initial steps you can take.
And one of the things is being aware of actually what's happening, so it comes down to getting the unknowns to being known. One of the companies that I spoke to recently had an official policy of deploying BlackBerries. That was the mobile device of choice, and they had a BES server and issued BlackBerries to users who needed it. And that's what they thought would solve the problem of mobile data security. But they hadn't turned off a number of back-end infrastructure services that came with Exchange. And what they found when they did an independent audit was that almost all the people who had BlackBerries also had iPhones, but also a bunch of other people were using iPhones to access email, etc., and those weren't even being touched by any management or security. They weren't being monitored, and until they did the audit, they had not a clue that that was happening. So from being perceived as a secure BlackBerry implementation, they were actually running on a back-end iPhone infrastructure.
So the thing to do 5 minutes after you've watched this Regcast is to go out and start auditing. That's a good start, isn't it? And I suppose word gets round, Sasi, doesn't it, in organisations. If someone finds out that you can actually connect with your iPhone, and for whatever application they're using, then it's quite a handy way to do it. Then word quickly gets out to everybody else who's got an iPhone, and they've all connected by the end of the day.
Yeah, and what's more natural than just trying to log in with your username and password when you get an iPhone? You often don't need too much support to be able to do so, and unless you've taken steps to manage by policy, etc., your user base will be trying to do this because it's natural.
You don't even know you're breaking the rules, do you, really? Absolutely. Some of the time. Well, I mean, that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it.
When we talk about this, this whole behavior, I call this the user mandate.
Yeah.
And I think the unexpected for organizations that they really have to think about is the power of the user mandate. They will use devices that you may not sanction. They will use applications that you may not sanction. And we're looking at this slide here. They're going to go off and access on networks that you may not control, all with the purpose of simply accomplishing objectives, not to put the organization at risk, but you have to enable that.
Yeah, and one of the things we find is that it's still really connecting to email is one of the major drivers behind a lot of these mobile devices. That's their main productivity benefit. There are a few now coming through with a few more apps, but apps is often a little bit further down on the list of priorities. Mostly it's let's connect to email and contacts and calendar and get things working. And one of the things that you guys may be able to do is actually have a trade-off, and that is if you want to actually support a whole bunch of devices accessing email, have it as a supportable company policy to do so, but ask for something in return from the user base, such as acceptable use policy and restriction on certain apps, etc., those types of things. So ask in a quid pro quo of enabling them to use their devices on email in a supported way, have an acceptable use policy in at the same time. So there's a benefit on both sides.
And should people be allowed to use just any app they want, or the native apps on a smartphone, for example?
That's a difficult question.
Because there's a question in about this already. Yeah.
Having a laissez-faire approach to devices and apps often just leads to a lot of complexity. So our advice would usually be have some freedom, but within a reasonable range, so have limits on how far you're prepared to go, have a choice of apps. Now, if it's their own personal equipment and they can run it on their own and you can secure against it, there's no point limiting necessarily their own use. But in the corporate space, in that area, the enterprise-managed apps and services, there needs to be boundaries. It shouldn't be a free-for-all.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about this one, Sasi?
You know, it's a tough decision for organizations to make, but I have to agree with Andy. You can't operate in the corporate environment, whether it's on a personal device or a public network, without some notion of a boundary. I would say that sometimes this debate is very intellectual, and oftentimes when users are actually presented the choice, it isn't that bad. Mm-hmm. And for those really egregious requirements that people may have, you can have a completely personal device. Not all devices have to access, but there is that trade-off. And it oftentimes, when you look at the material applications that you're talking about, it's not that controversial. So it's sort of an intellectual shift that has to happen.
And often, if you give a free range of apps, there's often duplication and reinventing the wheel because they're all trying to do certain similar things, but in different ways. So often, if you find out what the workforce needs or the company needs for those apps and services, you can often find a single supported app or service to use rather than having to, say, maintain 15 different approaches across different BUs and user groups.
I mean, one of the ways in which the companies resolve this complexity in the past is to go towards a sort of a thin client terminal services sort of thing for their laptops when you had PCs in the office and laptops when you weren't. Do tablets and smartphones, do they break this model?
Not really. You can still deploy things like thin client applications, but what we found is even in the PC space, those tend to have fairly niche applications because of the limitations they put on where and how you can work. So unless you've done, you understand the user groups using it, those often end in failure if you try to just roll it out in a blanket fashion across the whole organisation.
I guess people still tend to find a way around it, Ceci, don't they?
They do find a way around it, and I was just thinking about this as well. I mean, one of the big challenges facing organizations, quite frankly, is just the volume of web-based applications that are available.
Yeah.
You can just download them on any device and use them. And that's one of these unsanctioned things. And what's the answer to that? I think there's two things. One is, yes, you have to have some level of boundaries. So you have some security measures around data loss and so on. But the other is to actually extend your security solutions out. It gets back to that balance between controlling and enabling. You want to give some degree of enablement so that folks have a solution on their device that can secure them from malicious downloads or malicious applications and so on. So you can strike the balance and make it a win-win.
Okay, let's have a look at the what you believe the threat landscape is at the moment, Ceci, and how that's changing. Because I'm interested in what you think is different about the nature of the threat we're facing now.
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic because, of course, Blue Coat, we focus a lot of our research efforts on looking at the threat landscape. We see up to 1 billion requests a day from our user base. We have over 75 million users. And what that means is it's a very substantial data set. I don't think it's going to be a surprise to any of your viewers that obviously the threat landscape continues to be dangerous and things get to be continually more targeted. What is interesting, and we call it out here on this slide under this bullet of Malnets, is our research that we published earlier this year in our security report, highlighting that with the analysis we've done, we've been able to start to characterize and isolate the infrastructure that cyber criminals use to launch attacks. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but the point fundamentally is organized crime is now very, very focused. I like to talk about it as low investment, high return. And so these attacks have a set of physical infrastructure that's established. And what we found when they launch an attack is these infrastructures will often go to sleep. And these folks will open them up again days, maybe months, maybe a year later, and reuse that infrastructure to launch new attacks. So having a solution that allows you to start to identify and block those not only protects your organization, this becomes relevant to these BYOD and mobile devices, because these folks, we're about to publish our September report that highlights our most recent discoveries, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone to know these infrastructures that are established, we're tracking over 500 of them. They're now being redeployed to target mobile devices. And there's different tactics that we cover in the report for folks that are interested, but this is the degree of sophistication and investment that's going on there. And from the point of view of a malware operator, the value associated now with BYOD or mobile devices is enormous, and you intersect that with high-value individuals. And this isn't just a paycheck indicator. It can be somebody who has access to intellectual property, somebody who has access to personal information. That becomes a great vector in. And they've got very sophisticated techniques. So it's important to understand that. Social networking is listed here as an example. We called out in our report, when we look at mobile usage that we see, social networking, it probably isn't a surprise, is one of the top usage categories. We also see from our research of threats that we block, 1 in 16 attacks comes from social networks. So that's just an example, and that's not even corporate use, but that creates an opening. And that's going to continue to get more complex when you look at, you lay those vectors on top of web-based applications that everyone wants to use, and we've talked about examples, and forecast that onto the volume of devices that are out there. It really creates a perfect storm.
I mean, a very simple question on this is, inside the organization, do you block social networks?
You don't need to. And I was at a user conference yesterday, and I asked for a show of hands. I said, how many people block Facebook? 3 people put up their hand out of 50. And we see that. And my advice to folks was, it gets back to this enablement idea. Yeah, of course you can block Facebook if you want to. Why would you want to? We deal with a lot of federal agencies here in the UK, in the US, who use what we call, actually they call it, a read-only Facebook. For many federal agencies, public opinion is of vital importance. We're better to start to understand what's going on than through the use of Facebook. So what they do is enable it, but block any interactions. There's no posting, no emailing, no chatting, because they don't want to risk data loss, they don't want to risk infection, they don't want to have that degree of interaction, but they want the intelligence. That's an extreme example. Most businesses get tremendous marketing impact, they get a lot of other values from not just Facebook, other social networking solutions. And so my advice is there are lots of solutions out there that allow you to safely enable it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Andy, I suppose what comes out of this as well is that there's no particular point solution that's going to solve our problems here, is there?
No, it's quite complex. It takes both applications, infrastructure, devices, and intelligence to bring it all together. And I think one of the things we've just got to understand is that the threat landscape is very fast-moving and doesn't really follow too many fixed patterns. We just got to look at 2 recent examples. We've had a Java zero-day exploit, and we've had a recent Internet Explorer zero-day exploit, for example. And these take time for the attacks to prepare. They often compromise devices. They're out there being used. And unless you can actually start to get a lot more intelligent about how we are able to manage and shut down some of the entry points of some of this malware, we are going to be at risk. And we can't just ignore it. I think that's the key takeaway. Yeah. We cannot ignore and hope for the best, because any company, any device, any person can be targeted. So we're getting this combination of extremely targeted attacks where people of interest or value in a company may be spearphished. And on the other hand, we've just got these really broad attacks looking at existing flaws that have yet to be patched.
Spearphished is terrific. Thank you very much. Does that mean, Sasi, that we end up with a policy that ideally should follow the user?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, but that's not really possible, is it?
Well, I think it is possible, and there are solutions out there that now allow you to establish that framework. Obviously, Blue Code is one of them. When you look sort of at this framework of this individual in different venues, this sort of is the confluence, right, of unknown devices, known networks, unknown networks, known applications, unknown applications. So it all works together to create, you can call it context, you can call it their situation. And so what we're talking now about is situational policies, understanding what behavior you want to allow, depending on the device, how they're accessing, and who that authenticated user is. You may decide, for example, that you're going to allow an application outside of the corporate network that you're not going to allow within. And you can do that with a very solid security posture. So these are just decisions that organizations start to have to think about. This is not different from the challenge many organizations face around data loss prevention solutions. DLP sounds very exciting. In fact, it's quite complicated for organizations to understand specifically what information are they trying to protect. Social security numbers are obvious. Bank account numbers are obvious. But when you start talking about intellectual property and that kind of confidential information, it's not easy. So organizations have to layer through that. DLP in today's case is still very compliance-driven because it's so complicated. I think here, from a policy perspective, you absolutely can have policies that follow the users. We do that for our customers today. The challenge organizations have is to start to rationalize what's appropriate for their company in terms of these situational requirements for their users.
Well, you get into an organisational problem, don't you, Andy, where you have to sort of then start categorising users so that you can create the policies for them and work out what's appropriate.
You do need to, and it also needs to be consistent across the different device types, for example, and data types and application types. So, yes, it is about understanding the user base and who you want to protect and how you want to protect them. The other side, coming back to the challenge of trying to get, say, a single approach across all devices, is up until recently, it's been very difficult to get a consistent management interface that can cover, say, the desktop or notebook PC, as well as the whole bunch of new smartphones and tablets, etc. We're starting to see solutions coming to market that can do that, but very few will actually do, including the PC and including the smartphones, all the types of smartphones to a consistent level. And we still think that probably has some room to go, but we've got to start somewhere and look at the improved solutions that are coming to market, and then trying to decide what minimum policy level we can apply to be compliant with certain areas, and then look at specific areas that we need to actually put additional tools or investment into to bring them up to scratch.
Because you talk about turning the solution on its head, isn't it? Because even when we were discussing this a couple of years ago, then I remember that the discussion was very much around deciding how secure you want to be, select your devices on that basis, and the management tool that applies to that device on that basis, and then you can go ahead with your smartphones or whatever little things that you have connecting to the network. We're saying now, don't think about it that way anymore. You have to. It all comes down to the management, and then trying to apply a consistent security across whatever management tools you have.
Trying to deal with each device individually will require a lot of investment in specific tools and a lot of attention. And when one change is applied, how do you make sure it's propagated to each of the different types of devices and platforms? So what we're really looking for now is the ability to set one policy and then have an engine that can look at the capabilities of all the devices under management and put
outwards.
It in place as much as possible, and where you can't apply policy, at least then you know about it, you can assess it and decide what applications you might want to run with that type of security capability in place. So it is about trying to draw them all much more together, set a policy in one place and let it drill down as appropriate, and then deal with the problems that arise, rather than trying to have each device with its own particular management solution.
Okay. So do you do that?
We do that, and you can think of it like this. You can have a Tim Phillips policy, and your policy on your laptop when you're in your corporate network may have one set of rules. Your policy, once you log out and you're on the Starbucks or some public Wi-Fi, may be a different one. You switch over to your tablet, and you'll have a different policy, and these are all situational to your organization, what makes sense for you, all with a very solid security posture. We offer that capability today. All of that is tied up back up to you and what enables you within your organization. And so that's the shift in looking at it, and it's no longer about we have the laptop profile. It's the Tim Phillips profile.
Are your customers that sophisticated in their thinking at the moment?
Our customers are very sophisticated in terms of what they're doing in their corporate networks. And we talked about the degree of penetration in the top enterprise, and that really just speaks to the fact that when you look at federal agencies, financial agencies, and so on, the degree of sophistication in their policy implementation, you talked about this group can do this and this individual can do that, that absolutely exists today and becomes a very pivotal part of how they run their organization. What we're talking about now is taking that same richness and extending it out. It's really all we're doing. We're extending its implementation may be complex, but you're extending that same behavior out to devices and unknown networks now. At Blue Coat, we talk about it as securing the user. To secure the network today, you have to secure the user on any network, any device, anywhere.
And we would typically look at it as securing both the user, the apps, and the information. Those are the three, I think, fundamentals of how you approach putting this in place. So it's understanding all three of those and the context that binds them together. So absolutely we'd agree with that type of approach.
It becomes quite complicated quite quickly.
It does, unless you have the ability to tie it all together with a single common approach. If you have, you basically just get an exponential explosion of complexity if you have to take those elements and then map it down to each individual product set or capability feature set.
Mm-hmm. Let's have a look and see the dimensions, because we mentioned the dimensions of this problem several times. When you look at this, first of all, from reg readers, the personal devices, they are concerned about them.
They are, and security, no surprise, tops the list.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps surprisingly, it's also things like data loss, and it's not just confidential data loss. It's also what happens when you're using a device to do a sale, for example, and you've got notes and other things all to do with it that are not synced back anywhere into any of the corporate applications, and that device gets lost, and there's no way to bring the information in. Mm-hmm. So those are concerns as well. So it's not just... It may not be people using the data, it's actually losing important data before it's replicated into other systems. So that's an area that also needs to be got on top of. And, of course, the ever-present compliance issue, particularly in the regulated industries, finance, healthcare, etc. And when we do studies like this, one of the big issues that keeps coming back is there's not enough capability in a lot of the new platforms, particularly smartphones and tablets, because they're fairly new in the market. There's a lot of diversity. They haven't really been designed to be managed by the enterprise. And so a common request we get from many is we need to improve the base security level of these new platforms. And we can either try to do an infrastructure side and don't have an agent on the device and do a lot of back-end intelligence to try and improve that posture or cater for it. Or we could do a combination of back-end plus agents, for example, on the device that can improve the native capability so that they work together to perform a 1 + 1 = 3, so the sum is greater than the whole of the parts.
Yes, and it's now I've moved you on to this one because I want to because this links in with the question that we've been asked about this, which is the boundary between personal and corporate information. And this is always a problem when we get into these personal devices that are further up your graph here, where there's more employee control and increasing risk of data loss. That gets blurred, doesn't it? The data gets mixed together, and so you've got two risks. The first one is that confidential data goes outwards, and the second one is that the company ends up sort of harvesting personal data as well.
You can, and also the company may be at risk. For example, if it starts to host things like downloaded video content, torrented stuff, for example. At what stage is the liability? Because it may be hosted on a corporate PC and the company may be liable. So you don't just want to allow carte blanche access. It needs to be managed. And somehow we've got to be able to separate the personal activities and use from the enterprise activities.
How do you do it, Sasi?
Well, you have to set these situational policies. I was smiling at the example because I just had somebody talk to me yesterday here in London about a client downloading some movie on BitTorrent. And I guess they moved mid-download. It was running in the background, or the download was scheduled or something, and they'd come into the office. And they were going about their business, and this movie was downloading in the background. Well, that's not accepted by corporations. It seems the movie company called, the publishing company called the company and said, you have illegal downloads. And so that's a perfect example of this kind of thing. So you can set situational policies like that says, look, we don't allow BitTorrent in the office. Sorry. That's a very easy rule to set. But when you look at a
fairly uncontroversial rule as well.
Most employees would. And this individual in this example didn't intend that to happen.
Yeah.
It just occurred. I mean, they're going, but this is the blurring, right? And so it's hard to be in control of all that and hard to be aware of all of that. But the converse example, I had somebody in the U.S. talk to me about somebody in the Navy who, on Facebook inadvertently or, didn't think, they posted that they were being shipped out, and they were going off somewhere. And this is, of course, Army and Navy intelligence. And so that created actual problem in this particular case, without going into the particulars. It's another example of where the individual didn't take deliberate actions. It's the blurring.
Yes.
And so how do you now, the answer is not to block Facebook, but the answer is to raise awareness on these things, and you can set situational policies. And the BitTorrent example is a perfect example of that. User X is on the corporate network, BitTorrent's blocked. We can't allow that sort of thing. And the user would probably look at that and say, well, I didn't mean to download the movie in the office anyway. It's running
for you to find out that I was downloading the movie.
Yes.
That's it. But now, for everyone who's there saying, yeah, we don't know about this, we're working on it, what we've got is very clear data here, isn't it, Andy, that people don't tend to do anything about it until it's too late.
Yeah, and especially once we move outside of the regulated industries and into, the mid-market side of things, it's often a case of, well, we're doing all right, Jack. We're not really have a problem at the moment. We've got new apps and things we need to be spending our money on.
Yeah.
Until one day a major infestation happens and you have a data loss or a malware problem and you've suddenly got to deal with it. And when you've got thousands of people on the road, how do you go about recovering them when they're out in the field for say 2 weeks and they're not going to be back in? How do you get them to be recovered, productive, and working again? So what we'd like to see more in the Reg user land is an appreciation that security is actually a fundamental of running IT, and especially when you've got a really highly mobile and multi-device centric workforce. You have to get on top of it and invest, because if you leave it too late, you'll have had a problem. And data leaks these days come with stiff penalties. We're seeing fines in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds when data goes missing. Just a dropped USB laptop, if not USB stick, if not encrypted, can be a multi-thousand-pound fine, for example. So it's not about waiting until something happens. We have to get on top of this.
The other thing I would add to that, and I completely agree with that, I think that's a very common problem. I'm constantly surprised by organizations I talk with that haven't got at their fingertips how much money they spend just on laptop remediation. And this is back to the discussion we had earlier, but it isn't just about smartphones. People and businesses are incurring costs just on laptops today because they haven't taken the measures that they ought to, and they have this false sense of security again. Well, nothing's happened. Yes, but you're spending X amount per quarter remediating laptops that got infected, and you may not have resulted in a data breach yet, but you can just eliminate that cost. And you flash forward that again onto the volume of personal and mobile devices. That's a lot of money that you can start to save just on that IT resource piece, never mind eliminating the risk of fraud and so on.
Does this whole thing get wrapped up in the sort of bring your own device planning stage as well? Because I mean, just had a question in saying, does the organisation end up paying for your data plan and stuff like that if you're getting sort of data? I guess you could make a bigger conversation on this to say, we'll do this for you with your devices and help you to use them, and then you do this for us because here are the rules we set around it. Is that a positive way to talk about what might be avoided because it seems like a negative thing?
Absolutely. I think you have to look at it as a win-win, and I think a lot of organizations are trying to. As we've been discussing, it is complicated, so it takes time. Some organizations take the posture of, yes, I'll give you email access, but it's your device, and so we're not requiring you to carry it. Other organizations will say, you have access, we will cover your plan up to this amount, which we think is reasonable given what your role is in this company. So people have, again, situational postures on this based on what their business is and what makes sense.
Which one do you think is going to work in the end?
I really do believe it depends on the kind of business. There are those businesses that require employees to have access. Maybe, for example, sales forces. Companies that have large sales forces are absolutely going to extend out these kinds of solutions and probably cover that because that's a requirement. If you take a different example, let's say a manufacturing company where people are in the facility, they may take a different posture which is appropriate for their business.
Now, one reason why we need to get ahead of this, from what you're saying, Sasi, is that when the attack shows up, that's not really when the attack started.
Yeah, I mean, this is where we were talking earlier about a shift that has to happen in the industry. And it's a security industry today when particularly you look at web-based attacks is very reactive just because that's the nature of the technologies. You look at an attack that happens, you analyze the symptoms, and days or weeks later you're reacting with a solution. without getting into the technical details of it. What we're showing here is, again, a lot of the work we've done around uncovering these malware delivery network or malnet infrastructures. And the point for your viewers is this: attacks don't happen spontaneously. There's planning involved. There's investment involved. And so there's an infrastructure phase that we show here. And that's the phase in which these operators are actually establishing the physical requirements of their network. And then at some period of time, we'll actually pull the trigger and launch the attack. The Blue Coat solution in this context, we're monitoring that and blocking these suspicious infrastructures even before they launch. And that's how we offer protection out to our customers, independent of device. A lot of the more traditional solutions, by design, are waiting for the attack, analyze the AV signature or the web signature, and then work to implement a defense. And with looking at the volume of devices and usage now, most companies can't afford that.
That's just not practical anymore.
It's just not practical anymore. It's not scalable.
When we're looking at these, when we're looking at implementing that, then it takes the security policy as well that you're implementing. It becomes a half and half. Half goes on outside the company and half goes on inside the company. So I suppose being able to match those two together becomes important.
No, I don't think so. I think it gets back to what Andy was talking about as well. When you think about the applications and you think about the user and the access that they need, you're putting that context together and applying the rules that make sense. There would be some examples where, you can talk about Dropbox is our favorite example of most corporations won't allow that within because there's security challenges. It's not a sanctioned application. But they might allow that on the outside because users want and expect that kind of access. There are other similar examples. People use applications like LogMeIn to be able to access remotely, not a sanctioned IT application. Can you stop somebody from using that on their personal device? Should you? I would say probably not. Within the corporate network or in a branch office, do you want to allow that? You don't have to. It's not a sanctioned application. So I think it really comes back to that context and setting the policy based on that situation of all those parameters.
I just smiling because Roland's just mailed in to say you're 2 months in the life of an attack. Is missing out the cleanup phase at the end of it, which is another 1 or 2 months. So
Absolutely
2 months
right.
in the life of a 4-month attack.
And this is what you have showing for your viewers here is an example from Blue Coat that we published in our security report. Your viewers are welcome to read the details of that. But the point of this particular timeline, it illustrates an actual attack and how they set up the infrastructure. The point is this. These folks established infrastructure in this example somewhere in the June timeframe. And then they didn't pull the trigger until, I think, the September or October timeframe.
Yeah.
That's a very long sleep phase, but that's a perfect example of the strategies. They aren't immediate. They aren't real time. You don't know when they're going to trigger, so it's important to identify that infrastructure. And you're right, once it's unleashed, even if you're using a solution that takes hours, that's hours you can't afford. And so we've made that shift to block at the source versus reacting to the attack type. And you're right, if you correlate what companies spend, even in an attack that took 4 hours, it's volumes of money. So that's great feedback from your user. Thank you. We'll add the cleanup phase to our timeline.
We make a very long slide, yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, I mean, to be frank, this is quite a difficult thing to do because it requires a lot of intelligence and insight and monitoring and a whole bunch of cooperation across the industry to pull together. So it's a great start, and I think the more we can build on these types of technologies, the better, because we'll be better off. Having something that basically can attend the scene of a crime 3 days later is not great.
No, let's have a look at some of the specifics, because so far we've given people bad news and very bad news. And so we'll have a look at how policy responds to this in a little bit of detail for the last part of the Regcast. Now, we're saying that at the moment, Andy, the Reg readers, they're not managing these devices.
A lot of them aren't. Some are on top of it and actively trying to make it happen. But if we look at the slide here, basically more than half are really not suited in terms of getting on top of the problem.
Shame on you, honestly.
So it is a big problem, and one that you really should be thinking about.
Okay, yeah. Is this... well, I guess your users aren't like this, or else they wouldn't be your users, Sasi. When they come to you, Are people in a state of disarray?
I think that, you will be surprised. We see very consistent results from organizations thinking about these personal devices. It's still new, and they're still actually determining what their BYOD policy should be. And that's very much the dialogue that we've been having. We introduced a cloud-based service last year that allows organizations now the option of extending the web security out onto mobile devices. So it's not the availability of solutions that's the challenge. It's this whole discussion about what makes sense. And organizations also are trying to strike that balance.
Yeah.
I don't think companies are trying to be Big Brother and lock down, but they do have a responsibility to control and protect organizational assets. So how do you start to... And when we have some recommendations on that, I think as we look at the security gaps that you have on the next slide and how you rationalize all of that, we have a first recommendation. You see the solid security bar across all of these locations. The point that we make to our customers, and I would make it to your viewers as well, is a first step you can take is simply extending consistent policy across all devices on your corporate network. There are a lot of companies today that are using policy controls on the corporate network for laptops, but allow mobile devices to come and use the corporate network and roam free because they haven't thought about it yet. Another thing that we highlight to our customers, we recently announced a capability to apply application controls to mobile applications. So we have a lot of customers that have Facebook controls, for example. They allow Facebook, they may not allow uploading of attachments as an example. Most organizations are not aware that the mobile Facebook application is different from the web application. Right. So somebody can't do an upload on their laptop. They're trying to get something done. They have some project going on. They whip out the mobile device and boom, 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 off they go. And so one very simple call to action is look at your corporate network, go back to your analytics and your reports and look at what devices you're allowing on. You can allow them, but ensure consistent policy across those devices. Your mobile user that then can't upload on Facebook is going to say, okay, well, I'm going to go do this on Wi-Fi. You can do that if that's your personal stuff. But nobody will dispute, as a first stage, getting your own house in order.
Absolutely. And one of the things we find, for example, is oftentimes when it comes to mobility, there's often a focus on trying to do things like encrypting the device, for example, and setting up a secure mail delivery system, which when we then ask, well, are you doing that on your notebooks? Are you encrypting the disk? No, we're not doing that. Are you encrypting your email delivery on the notebook? No, we're not. So again, it's about making sure everything comes up to a consistent standard and doing it and prioritizing which areas need to be addressed first. So if you don't encrypt your notebooks, is there a sense in bringing your smartphones up to the same level, or is there another thing you should be focusing on first? Because you've got a big risk across that. Now, if you can do it easily in certain areas, go ahead and do it, but make sure that you're bringing the other end up to speed as well.
You're an encrypt everywhere if you can, man, aren't you?
Ideally, and the technology is there now that we can do it, and the performance hit is really small due to a lot of the architectural advancements in the processors and other areas. So absolutely, encrypt everywhere where possible, just the base file systems to protect against loss or theft. It's a great get-out-of-jail card-free investment to do and to have in place. But then, of course, we still need to think about the data that's actually being used in the apps, because that's able to be unencrypted because of the user. So then you still have to think about that type of encryption and control.
You know, when you look at what's going on out in the web, Facebook is encrypted. Gmail is encrypted, and so it's here, and so it's a completely sensible thing to do. And when you look at web security solutions, I mean, from a Blue Coat perspective, we've supported inspection of encrypted traffic to company policies for years because it's very important to a lot of institutions. It's become more commonplace now, and it is a very sensible precaution to take that can work with the solutions that you have in place.
Now, another basic thing we've got here, Andy, is that monitoring and detection doesn't seem to be quite up to speed.
Well, what we found is there's been a lot of investment in some of the back-end infrastructure side of things, so really monitoring, say, the email systems. And we've even seen quite a lot of investment around the notebook and the desktop. They have quite comprehensive solutions in place. But when we look at the investment around the mobile side, so the smartphones and the tablets, it's lagging quite a way behind. And a lot of that has been because often it's a new type of product, it's point products and other areas, and it's new, and that always takes time to become established. So what we find is there's we're often relying on the back-end infrastructure and monitoring that to detect any issues with the mobile side of things.
Well, that doesn't work, does it?
It won't work long-term, that's for sure. So one of the things that's definitely got to be in the plan for the next 12 to 24 months in terms of improving security for end-user computing has to be making sure that the capabilities and the sophistication of the security on those devices is coming up to a level to approach that of the notebooks and the desktops.
Right, now just move you on to your life cycle thing here as well, because I've seen this before. I don't understand why that's in here.
Well, I think it comes down to there's many different points we have to think about, and part of it is choosing the acceptable bounds of devices, etc. But oftentimes, all we think about is provisioning the devices and letting them go. But really what we need to do is revisit the security throughout the life cycle to make sure it's up to date and appropriate, because threats and the landscape develop. But even more importantly is how do we deprovision at the end, and we've got to be sure about that, because some companies just let the devices be let go into the ether and don't care about destroying what's on them, and it's still got all the configuration. And the other side is, if they do decommission them, they may destroy the whole device, including all the personal data, and that can make it a really difficult process to manage.
So and that means people don't report them when they think they've lost them?
They might not report them if they think they've lost them and all their data may be wiped, so being able to basically retrieve the data before you wipe it, if possible. But the other thing is, if you do destroy the personal data, who's responsible for actually making sure that the user can actually get that back again when it is wiped and returned to the person? Do they have to just manually copy all this off? How do you go about doing that? What support infrastructure do you have in place? That may make it a really complex decommissioning cycle and something really to think about.
It's 24 hours in a day problem, isn't it? Now, Sasi, let me give you a few minutes just to talk about, because we talked about a lot of things, and from time to time I've said, do you do that? Do you do that? Do you do that? I can give you a few minutes just to say what you actually do.
Yeah, absolutely. So Blue Coat does, as I mentioned at the beginning, offer a very rich set of policy controls to businesses, together with a very robust enterprise-grade web security scheme. So this, we talked about the research, what we do, and how we analyze malnets and so on. This is all backed by a threat intelligence system that we call Web Pulse. That's very much the engine that enables us to provide global threat protection. And so here's what I would tell you. Most businesses have a web security solution of some kind within the corporation. I mean, that's the degree of awareness around the web. You have the ability now to extend that kind of a solution out to your remote and mobile users. The best way to do that, regardless of which solution you use, is with a cloud service. These devices are roaming around. Users do not always VPN back in, nor should they have to. And so that's very much the reason why a cloud-based solution makes a lot of sense. With our capabilities there, you can now have this concept that we show on the next slide of having this universal policy structure, which is what you very well described earlier as policies that can follow the user. So now as you have somebody at corporate, they're protected, they have the corporate policy, they've moved outside. You want to extend that same grade of protection. They should be able to use Facebook. If they click on a bad link, they're protected. Nothing bad should happen to them. So now you've enabled them with the applications, but you're securing them. The policy that follows them should be able to do just what we described now. You can say, this person's on a public network. It's actually their personal device. We're going to enable log me in or whatever is the application that they want to use. And all of that gets tied together with a unified reporting capability. And this really gets back to some of the things Andy was describing. When we talk about policy recommendations for companies, and what I would tell your users is you have to start by understanding what's going on in your company. And that's the basis whereby you're going to be able to make these situational decisions. What makes sense for your business? Who are these users? What are the rational groups? What are the sensible policies that then let you start to enable this workforce to actually accomplish your business objectives? It's a very positive way to do that. And so,
Sasi, if you don't mind me saying, you're a surprisingly positive and relaxed security person, because, sometimes sitting in the third chair over there when we do security things, it's like Dr. Doom has come to visit, and there are people saying, you can't do this, you don't do that, you stop people doing that, and really, really bad things have already happened to you. You've just got to find out. You sound a little bit more positive about this.
I really do view it in a positive way. I mean, I can come back and talk to you for an hour about threats and silly things that people do.
Don't do that. We've had a few of those.
But I think that the opportunity is this, and Andy talked about this earlier. The companies that don't embrace this and think about the technologies that are there to help them, And Blue Coat has invested tremendously in this. And the research we're doing around blocking infrastructure at the source and not waiting, that's a huge amount of innovation and effort on our part, because we do view this as an enablement. Organizations are using the web. The web is now part of the corporate network. So that's old news. And in order to enable that, that was a very first stage of enablement. Companies that we deal with deploy these kinds of technologies. This whole mobile explosion in BYOD and this blurring is more about us establishing that rapport and how we're going to make that work and resolving that contention, and less about the technologies, because the technologies are there. The companies that embrace that and find the path through that, you can start by sorting out these policies on your corporate network. And I tell some people, you wouldn't let people smoke in your house. Most people would understand that. They go outside and do it. Now, banning smoking worldwide is a separate problem. You can start to resolve that. Organizations have that same opportunity. Take care of your corporate network. Get consistency there across all devices. Start by looking at the reporting, understanding who's doing what, and then put in the policies that make sense. Step 2 is the things we've talked about this past hour. Start looking at the policies that you need. What are your users doing? And then how do you want to start to triage that? What are you going to allow? What are you not going to allow? What's personal? What's corporate? And stage your users through that so they can start to make that adjustment. And we talked in the beginning of how this is just really an intellectual shift. The material objections that people have are fairly few, and you can manage those by exceptions. But Andy was saying earlier, the exception shouldn't be the rule, and I really agree with that.
Yeah. And to wrap us up, there's one thing that Mike points out here is that often employees do discover better ways of doing things, and so you just have to be able to accommodate that. And he's obviously worried about sort of licensing and things like that and how that explodes. But this can become part of a whole way of controlling that. Yeah,
it is, and I think it also represents a bit of a new reality for how IT has to think about servicing the business needs, because a lot of this will now be driven from a user-centric point of view, and if IT is not able to follow where the users want to go, because ultimately they're responsible for the efficiency of the business, driving revenues, and ultimately profit bonuses and everything else that comes in. So IT needs to understand, it needs to support a lot of these shifts and work out what it is that the users are using and requiring, and then ultimately, hopefully, coming down and distilling out an appropriate solution to make that happen if they found new and useful ways of working.
And in a word, this is not a one-time only process.
Absolutely not.
2 words.
Continuous.
It's a continuous process, though. Thank you very much. We are out of time, so Sasi and Andy, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Reg audience, for sticking with us. We hope we dealt with enough of your questions. We hope you found something in that. So let us know afterwards, because here at Reg we do more of what you want, less of what you don't want. It seems sensible, but so many people don't do that. I've been Tim Phillips, and from the Register, goodbye.